Hi, I'm your host, Larissa Worstiak. Through this podcast, I aim to empower and inspire jewelry entrepreneurs and innovators so they can thrive by doing what they love. I'm passionate about digital marketing for jewelry brands, and I'm excited to share my passion with you. This is episode 117, and today I'm sharing an interview with Paul Spinak, the founder of The Marketing Machine, which is an innovative and creative marketing agency based in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina. Paul is the agency's creative director, marketing strategist, brand guardian, and Salesforce, all wrapped up into one high-octane package. Paul and I first bonded over our shared passion for branding, and then I found out we had more in common, which doesn't really surprise me. We were both born and raised in New Jersey, so he's basically my brother from another mother. In this episode, we focus our discussion on two very nebulous topics that I find confuse many jewelry entrepreneurs: marketing strategy and branding. What in the world do these two terms mean, and how can you wrap your head around them as a small business owner? We'll be answering all these questions in the following interview. But before I get to the episode, I want to share some marketing related news and insights from the past week that caught my attention. Let's talk about TikTok. If your target customers are actually spending time on TikTok, and remember, take this with a grain of salt. I'm not saying you just have to be on TikTok. This is only if it makes sense for your brand. Then you should definitely start exploring, if you haven't already, how you can present your brand on TikTok. To address challenges that small business owners have with doing that, TikTok recently launched a new account called @TikTok4Business just for this purpose, to provide business owners with tips on using the platform effectively. TikTok can be a great way to expand the reach of your video content in an accessible and fun way. Again, especially if your target customers are spending time there. The trend for video marketing is definitely rising. It's here to stay. Video is not going anywhere, and a majority of people would like to see more video content from the brands they already follow and admire. So this new TikTok for Business account can be a great way to learn more about TikTok's offerings. I've said this a number of times on the podcast, but marketing simply can't continue to ignore the customer experience. And Paul and I actually talk about this a lot in the interview. Digiday recently published a great article about this topic. Customers today want a seamless and convenient experience. So you want to pay attention to your customers and then accommodate them accordingly in the best way that you can. The customer experience needs to be designed to fit the customer needs, not what you think the customer needs, but what the customer is actually telling you that he or she needs. To do this, small businesses have embraced automation and shifted expectations about automated customer experiences by making it easier for customers to connect with and access the brand. And finally, Facebook recently shared some great tips for how brands can increase customer loyalty. Today's consumers are looking for brands that support the same values that they do. So speak in a language the customer understands. Share your mission and values. Make it as easy as possible for your customers to understand those things. Be clear. Listen to your customers and actually communicate with them in a way that makes sense to them, in a way that they expect and want. Make your customers feel valued and special. Be honest, and always take ownership of your brand. If you want to get the links to the articles I share in this segment of the podcast, you can sign up for my email newsletter by visiting joyjoya.com/sign up, and you'll get a digest with the links every time a new episode drops. Without further ado, let's get to my interview with Paul. So, Paul, when I discovered that we were both from New Jersey, I was thinking, what is it about New Jersey that informs the way you approach marketing today? Can you make any connections between growing up in
I
New
can
Jersey and
actually.
marketing?
I can. I'm going to shut my email. I think that there's a transparency in which the way I develop my relationships with people. And I think that is 100% rooted in my Jersey way. And occasionally it could also be, you know, sometimes in my line of work, I have to say very uncomfortable things to people at very particular points in time. And there's something about my Jersey upbringing that, keeps me from being shy. I have to like speak my mind. And I find that so a lot of my trust building and that rapport building is very much rooted in, so it's not necessarily marketing, but my relationship building is very Jersey. That never goes away.
I love that. And marketing is so much about relationship building. So I think all those things are intertwined for sure. I would
No
definitely
doubt about
agree. I would definitely agree with that too. I mean, a lot of people, when I first talk to them, they don't know I'm from New Jersey, but I seem to attract a lot of New Jersey people and East Coast people. So I think there's just like a mutual understanding vibe that goes around.
I was going to use the word vibe. That's definitely what it is. And sometimes, and as soon as you know it, like as soon as you just said that, I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
Definitely. So
So
I
that's a
would
good
love.
question.
Oh, okay. I didn't mean to catch you off guard, but I loved your answer. You were like so prepared for it. You're like, I know. I don't even have to think about this. I just know.
And
So
I love that being as my background too. I
I
like to
love it
talk about.
too. So I'd love to focus this conversation about two things that a lot of entrepreneurs I speak to find a little bit mysterious and overwhelming and like nebulous. And those things are marketing strategy and branding. And they definitely go together in some ways. Let's talk first about strategy. I know these are two things that you specialize in, you have a lot of expertise in. So, define for the listeners in your own words, what is a marketing strategy?
Okay. So, I think depending on the size of the business, that answer could change a little bit. But overall, I would say strategy is like the overall uh, growth plan of the business. It's a umbrella, a much higher level thought process, and then it consists of many different components where it could be, understanding your target market, as from a data point of view. It could be messaging, brand would be under there. It's like, are all these components aligned to achieve that particular strategy in mind? And then when you get into like a marketing plan, you might be a little bit more into tactics and how are we going to accomplish that goal? What things are we going to do to support the marketing strategy, if you will?
I love that. So, I would say a lot of the listeners are solopreneurs or small business owners. Does a marketing strategy matter for them? If so, why or why not?
That's a great question. I think that there's a double-edged sword here. I think a lot of solopreneurs, they're so passionate about what they love to do about the business that it's sometimes difficult to sit down and do, boring planning stuff or think out the business from a business case point of view, because there are realities in those strategy sessions when you realize there are obstacles. And sometimes it's easier to just stay in la la land and just run with the passion. And I get that. And to be honest with you, I've met some very successful business owners who have done nothing but just drive it all the way through with passion. Now they leave a big wake behind them. And a lot of times we do rebrands on companies who've left that wake. And now we're trying to catch the whole company up with where they are. So there's no one right way, but I think that there's so much energy it takes to be a solopreneur and be small that if you have a plan and you're working toward it, your energy and your time is so selective that it's nice if you can check yourself. Is what we're doing today moving towards that or moving away from that? And so I think it's I can't see it's a bad idea ever to have that paperwork. It doesn't have to be this book. It just needs to be like, what am I doing? What are my goals? What are my resources? Who are my customers? What am I trying to accomplish here? Rather than just getting up and, turning the sign over that says I'm open. And so
I
I
like
think that
that.
that's a
Yeah.
little, yeah. So it's a little bit more being purposeful in your success as opposed to, being reactive to it.
I think that was a good point you made that there are some business owners who can get by for a period of time just on their drive, their hustle, their passion. But then I think that's a really very small percentage of people. And most that I speak to, no matter how passionate they are, they have like lives too. And life always ends up like getting in the way somehow. So if you don't have that like guiding North Star of a strategy there and or an accountability partner, like life is bound to get in the way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that that's true. It's difficult to break out of that single person mentality, right? And I think that I did it for the 22 years I've been in business. 9 of those years I did it by myself, and you can hit that ceiling all the time. On this is all one person can do, but the second you start bringing in a second person, your processes, your strategy, people are going to ask you questions. How should I think about the company in this? So you have to have that strategy, that plan, that piece of the business that lives outside of you, outside of your personality. It needs to start to find its way on paper, or at least in some mechanism that other people can understand what you're driving towards, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Such a good point. It's not a good long-term strategy to just have everything in your head and fly by the seat of your pants. If, as you said, if you want to scale, you want to bring other people on your team, you're going to need to get it out of you. I feel like that's a very Simon Sinek philosophy where like you can only rely on your personality and yourself, your unique value for so long. And then that has to like live somewhere else so other people can also communicate that when they represent your business.
Yeah, we're writing a core messaging document for a pretty substantial financial company right now, and the mission behind it is because one of the guys is, he's the legacy owner, but he's got some really sharp people under him, and he's got to come up with a sort of transitional messaging that, has his DNA in it, but it can't be about him anymore. It's not about him anymore. And somehow that needs to be written down, because otherwise everybody underneath him is going to tell their own story about what it means to them. So there needs to be one story and not 12 versions of it. But a lot of times that part can come up, and working with other people or making transitions, that's where these documents and language and plans and strategies come into play.
Yeah, that's a great point. I work with a lot of jewelry brands to like write their brand story or their core messaging, like what you're saying.
Huh?
And many of them, or actually a lot of the ones I've been doing recently are what is the word when the brand is like named after the person? Now I can't think of
The
eponymous,
spokesperson. Uh-huh.
a fancy word. So there's like always this question, like, where's the separation between the person and the brand? And like, do you want to scale? Do you always want the brand to be equal to you? Or is there like a divide there? And it's a very difficult conversation that we have because sometimes these business owners haven't even thought about that question before.
Yeah, that when the when the owner becomes part of the brand, it gets interesting. There's a lot of I think that strategy, one of the questions, how often do you look at the strategy, right? That's often. Well, if you have the owner as the spokesperson, or like we're doing it's like a salad company. It's like a greenery they have here in Raleigh, and they've done really well. And last we did a rebrand, we got them off the ground, but they wanted to put their faces on the packaging. And I sat them down and we had a conversation about an hour as to the pros and cons of doing that. And I was like, it's hard to undo this, right? So
Yes.
as soon as we put your face on there, and you guys lean into that, you're gonna if you ever want to stop, we have to like almost like unwind that a little bit, because people are going to associate that. The good side is, it reinforces the local aspect. It puts a face on it. It's a women-owned business. They wanted to show that. They get their hands dirty. They're not just like corporate owned. So and they decided that we're going to move forward with it. And then, it's like, well, every 5 years you might have to like redo your picture, or do you want to like,
Yeah.
do you want to be set in stone as, 20 somethings? Because already that was an issue that needed to be talked about, because the picture they wanted to use was already 4 or 5 years old. And I was like, I'm cool But, these are the kind of things you have to think about when you're getting that tight. That's like the full way when someone's completely is the brand.
Yeah.
And in jewelry, I would assume names are a big part of that, right? I assume,
Yes.
you know, so then in that case, the name has to mean something other than the person,
That's
right?
such a good
So,
point.
and you could do that. That's how you successfully do it. And that's how you could sell a business as a jewelry company in someone's name, and someone could keep the name as long as that name meant something. It means integrity. It means craftsmanship. It means, if you establish those things, then it still has value, even if that person was not involved. But if you don't take those steps, I think you can put yourself in a corner pretty quickly.
Yeah. For some reason, your story about the salad made me think of Wendy's and like how I believe Wendy is like an actual person or was an actual person, but became more like mythical and representative of something else and was always that like representation of a child, in that little image that Wendy's uses. That kind of made me think of that.
Well, you're not far off, because she came up, Wendy, in the conversation, because
That's funny.
it is, because what we did was we showed them about 20 other brands that have done it and how they do it. And you started seeing patterns. And one of the patterns you just touched on unknowingly was that they decided to immortalize her as like an animated thing, right? It's
Yep.
not a photo, it's not a photograph,
Yep.
right? So, then you're leaning into this caricature, which obviously gives you a lot more power for it to be a brand and disconnect from a human, right? But that was a choice that they made, where they could probably never show her face as part of the brand or be a spokesperson doing a commercial. That probably wouldn't feel right at this point, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So it's fascinating to me.
That's funny. So, okay, let's pretend one of the listeners is like, okay, I get it. I understand why a marketing strategy is important. Where should they start? Like, how can they do this so that they feel better, that they have a plan moving forward, or,
Okay.
an overarching view?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one, I think it's important to understand your target audience, and to really understand that, and big companies can spend money on research and all that, but I mean, just spend some time trying to figure it out. There's two things you could do that might be for a business that's already established. And if you have a Facebook account and if you have a website with Google Analytics on it, both of those provide you free information on, if you turn on the demographics aspect of the analytics, you can get information on who's visiting your page, at least who's shown interest thus far. Because a lot of times, a client will tell me who their customer is, and then we onboard them and we get all their analytics information, and we're like, yeah, hey, whoever you're going after is not who's responding. There's a disconnect there. So explain, so know your customer first. Try to make sure there's enough of them, right? If you make the most amazingly intricate jewelry that is so niche that you're going to get down to a smaller audience, you're going to have to figure out, how do I get that to that audience, right? And I think you're like messaging now, that could be a tagline. It could be, but it could be very deep on how do you describe the brand? What are the words that you use, so that over time, people associate your brand with a certain thing, some characteristics. And if you don't tell them what those characteristics are, they'll make their own up, right? So I think you want to be in control of the messaging a little bit. And you can, anybody can go online and find messaging tools, so it's not, you don't have to hire an agency. I mean, it does help to have guidance, but, for a small business owner to just sit, a lot of times they're motivated by themselves. Otherwise they wouldn't be a business owner. But, you can probably take an online messaging questionnaire that at least helps you figure out, why is this important? And what are the things that I need to kind of wrap my head around? I think most businesses don't. I get calls for all the time with companies having messaging issues because no one ever dealt with it. And they're finally getting around to understanding how important it is. And, for a small jewelry company, it could just be the language on your website. It could be when someone opens up that they bought a bracelet online and they get that package, when they open that package up, what's in that package? What's on a little card that you put in there? How do you connect with people?
Yeah, that's a great answer. I say know your customers so often on this podcast. I joke about like tattooing it on my forehead because it's just a broken record thing that I say.
You just got to do it backwards.
Oh yeah, exactly. Um I had a thought. Oh, so messaging for jewelry brands, I think it's important to also to add to your thoughts to research, know your competitors or know the other brands in the space because
yeah,
I look at jewelry brands all day long. It's my life. I see the same kind of messaging over and over and over. And I wonder, do these business owners realize how copycat they're sounding because the same words are being used, the same approach? It's just like endless. So, do you have any suggestions about how to find unique messaging?
that's good. That's good. When we do our brand development, we ask kind of funny questions to shake people out of the tree because I think, it's not uncommon for a business to get off the ground and emulate other businesses. I think there's nothing really terribly wrong with that. I think, getting a business launched is very difficult. But in jewelry, I would assume that, it's very personal too. It's also, it's very subjective. So I think having a strong brand in that particular industry is actually really important. I think people will buy into the maker. It's a maker's thing. There's humanity in jewelry, and I think people, will respond to that well. I forgot my point. I lost my.
Finding a unique message.
Oh yeah. So I think that, you know, I would want someone to define their own work, in ways, maybe like we'll ask questions. If your brand was a streaming radio station, what would it play?
I love that.
If your brand was a car, what would it be? Right. So if your if your brand, was a color, so there's other ways to pose questions that make people think about their brand in different ways. And sometimes you will shake out of that some vernacular that isn't typically used. Because I'm sure there's 20 words in jewelry that everybody
Yeah,
has on their table.
exactly. I should put together a
Also,
document of words not to use. Like, don't use these words because they've already been used so many times.
I think one of the biggest recommendations I would make is hire a copywriter.
Yeah.
Pay the money for a copywriter, because as good as you are at making jewelry, there are people just as good at playing with words. And, especially with something like a messaging, it's not like you may need this person all the time. You need that person to create a master document and, at least give you a framework. And I think that, it's worth every penny to have someone do that. So, let the wordsmiths do the wordsmiths. Yeah, it's tough. It's hard to do that, in the beginning. But it does pay off in dividends, I think, along the way, if you discipline yourself to get that done.
Definitely. So we sort of started touching upon this, but how often should a strategy be reviewed or updated? Like when should someone go back to it to make sure they're still on track or that it's still relevant?
That's a good question. Every client we have is different. And I would say the first thing is when they feel like things are off, if things aren't tracking well, if goals are not being met, or if realities are starting to come in that aren't. A lot of times, if you're developing something new and it's uncharted territory for the company or whatever, there's just unknowns. And so, you have to take that information and pivot. COVID was a very big pivot. It made me think of, we had a multi-location dry cleaning business, that had pickup and delivery sort of in place. But what they had over other dry cleaners is they had laundry service. So they do wash, dry, fold. And they had the delivery service that was set up. So it didn't take much to pivot to, hey, get your laundry done. And but to be able to harness all that messaging and get it out the door quickly was paramount. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, that's a really good example. I think COVID, big events like that, when you start when you're releasing new products or collections, maybe perhaps your customers are changing when new competitors come into the marketplace. I think those probably in addition to what you said as well.
Yeah, I think the change, I mean, COVID was an enormous change for a lot of businesses. And, some of them that had access to their customers or were able to pivot on their messaging quickly, I think, ones that seem to do a little bit better. I don't know how the jewelry business did. I'm not familiar with the industry, how that did during COVID. Um, well,
Well, the biggest challenge was people who relied on brick and mortar retailers, like that sold their jewelry to brick and mortar retailers or that had brick and mortar stores. If their e-commerce channel wasn't robust before COVID, then that was a big issue. They're all scrambling to like figure out how to get on e-commerce or optimize e-commerce. And then how do we suddenly convince our customers they should be shopping online if they hadn't been there already? That was, I think, the biggest hurdle.
that's a big hurdle.
Yeah,
I'm sure
pretty
that
big.
I'm sure that challenged many smaller jewelry places. Yeah, but I'm sure it motivated a lot of them who were on the fence about e-commerce or didn't have the time or energy, and then all of a sudden, were thrusted upon one, checking themselves: do I really want to do this? Do I have an audience? And what would it take to really position myself? There was a couple businesses that I saw really move quickly and make some very quick decisions, and then others that were very, very fearful to do anything. And I think that the ones who pivoted are the ones who are still kind of moving forward more quickly, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So we mentioned the word brand a few times. Brand is another nebulous, like scary term for a lot of people. It has a
Huh?
lot of moving parts. I know branding is your expertise or one of your expertises. Is that a word? I want to hear, what the heck is a brand? Can you define it for the listeners?
Yeah, I love that question. First, I think we have to remember that a brand, first I'll give you the boring answer. I think a brand is like a memory device, right?
Ooh,
You need a way to remember a business. That's the boring answer. But, getting someone to understand what a brand is, I think is like a way of putting a personality on a company and to make that a tangible thing that you can kind of understand what that company is all about. So where does it manifest? I think a brand is like every single touch point that a business has with said customer. And that's visual, it's auditory, but and for our clients that allow us, we will, I wouldn't say take control of, but we will address every touch point there is, from online messaging, online hold, to their windows and what their windows look like in their brick and mortar stores, and their emails. And because every touch point needs to be done in a consistent way, so there's continuity. And each one of those points almost like draws a dot, and that dot all together tells the story, and that story is the brand. And I think that people end up now. I think one of the other things I'm seeing changing about brands is they're now starting to take on like where do they stand socially, which is like a whole
yep.
nother layer of, and I'm a little mixed on that,
Yeah.
to be quite honest. But yeah, every touch point, and because it is a memory device, it should look the same, sound the same, and it should be like one movement altogether. I shouldn't see a TV commercial and then your YouTube, and then everything looks totally disconnected with one another. That would make me very upset.
Yeah.
And so I think if you think about your brand as just all the touch points where people come in contact with your business, that's where the brand lives.
I like the idea of a memory device. I've never really heard it described that way. So I think that's really cool. And for some reason, when you were talking, I was like thinking about a symphony orchestra and like how each instrument they're
Yes.
being like played slightly differently. There's different qualities. So those might represent like different touch points, but together,
Yeah.
like when you're listening to it, it's beautiful and it makes sense and all the parts fit together. I don't know why I thought of
Absolutely.
that, but
There is a synthesis to doing it well. And, some of the best rebrands we've done were companies who've gotten further than maybe they should have, right? They never cleaned up their act, and we come in and, do something they just never thought they could do internally and clean it all up. And sometimes it takes a year if they have a lot of assets and things, but it can really drive a business when all those things are done right and done well and are done thoughtfully.
definitely. I recently had a conversation with someone who said that he could argue that marketing is the way you answer the phone or how someone in your business answers the phone. And I think that that's true. And you were saying like hold music or whatever. Um, it's so much more, especially today in the digital world, about customer experience than it is about anything else. So exactly like you're saying, all the touch points need to be like providing a unified experience.
Yeah. The, you know, I, the online experience is a good example of that. If you're going to buy something online, and we're all trained through Amazon and other these big about how it can be done. So if your experience, when you can make a transaction on Amazon in 8 seconds, like literally you can get on and find. And so if your user experience is not anywhere in the ballpark of something they're used to, they end up with a negative feeling
Yep.
and or frustration, and those kind of feelings you never want customers to feel. It's the equivalent of someone walking to brick and mortar and there's two panes of glass to walk through and one of them is locked. And one of my biggest pet peeves is that if you have brick and mortar and there's doors that a customer can grab, it better be open. Don't make a customer bang on the wrong door that doesn't open, because the subliminal message is frustration and you made them feel foolish as they were entering your business, right? So every touch point, I think, you want them to feel good about the business. And
Yeah.
there's so many places where that could be done wrong. And customer service and websites are huge places where those things can go really wrong.
I think your door analogy is one of like the smartest things I've ever heard about user experience, because that can be another complicated topic, talking about marketing strategy, branding. Like user experience is a whole other thing, but you really just simplified it there with that metaphor.
Yeah, it's funny because over the years, I've almost wanted to like leave a business card where it says, like explains, keep your doors unlocked. Like don't ever when you have a customer bang into a door, it's just, you end up feeling stupid.
So how can a marketing strategy inform a brand and vice versa? Like what's the overlap there? How do they connect with each other?
Oh man, that's a great question. Oh, I mean, you could almost flow in and out of both things. I think, every time we engage with a client, they're always in different places, right? And I may always say it'd be perfect to do this in this order, but the reality is it can never be done in that order. So I almost want people to just dive in and start digging into it, whatever angle they come from, right? So I think that when it comes to the understanding the brand and the messaging, people find that a little bit more fun. So if that gets you to the table on understanding those things, that's great. But understanding your target market and the demographics, and you got to do that stuff too. And the reality is, when we do a rebrand, we make sure we're expecting the client to understand their target market. We can't be doing our market research while we're doing the brand. Typically that would be, they have an idea who they are. But in the onboarding process, we're going to ask them questions to make sure that they're clear on that, because the brand needs to be appealing to that customer.
Yep.
And so those things are constantly going back and forth with one another and support. So I don't know if I have an exact answer for you, other than that they're ebb and flowing within each other all the time. So they can affect one another at every, from one sentence to the next.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point you make. I was talking last week on the podcast about how marketing is never like a one and done thing. It's ever evolving. No company is ever going to be perfect at it. And I think what you said really supports that. It's like a living, fluid thing. And of
Yes.
course, a brand is meant to be sustained for the long term, but that's not to say that in the future there might need to be some kind of update or refresh or that it needs
Right.
to be rethought. And that's
Yeah,
fine.
absolutely. We have a multi-location appliance and mattress place. It's been one of our best clients ever. And we rebranded them. That's how the conversation started. And then we became their agency of record and really helped these guys explode. And we're about 6 years into the relationship. And so we're just having conversations now, especially during COVID. We weren't sure if we wanted to move forward with new creative. We were sort of in a pause. We had a lot of things in motion we were going to keep in motion, but it didn't make sense to throw a bunch of money into new creative. But now we're talking about, we're 6 years into this rebrand. The brand's fine, but all the other elements around it, like if you create a whole new campaign, like right now we have a campaign, it's called Create the Good Life. And it worked. And now we're going to just round it out a little bit. And to be honest with ourselves, Create the Good Life is like now more fitting coming out of COVID because people are craving these outdoor grilling and lifestyle things and entertaining and whatnot. So I think we were like, oh, let's stay with it, but let's broaden that. So the brand can refresh itself often without affecting like the logo or the general feel of the brand. But those touch points don't have to stay stale. You do want to give it some love every once in a while. And that depends on how much you're putting out there. If you're burning the candle on both ends and you have a lot of activity in the market, then maybe in 3 years you need to, give that a fresh. But, most smaller companies don't have the finances to do that. And they're not doing a lot of marketing but I think you don't want people to get stale of those interaction points and that's more like advertising, visuals I think about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, if someone listening is really struggling to find their voice or perspective in their brand, what recommendations do you have for them?
I would say, with the assumption that if they're a small business, they're probably not going to be able to afford engaging with an agency, right? Let's just assume that because that's probably the reality of it. It wouldn't make financial sense. There are some really good tools online. The brand development questionnaire that we developed over the years for our clients, was put together over years of things that we found online that we like. So, you just type in core messaging questionnaire in Google, you're going to have the first step of a great questionnaire. And if you look at 10 of them, 80% of the information is going to be the same. There's only so many questions that get to the bottom of your messaging. So, Google, and that's what's changed since when I started the business 22 years ago, these were like coveted IP things for agencies. Now everything is available. So it just takes a little bit of self-motivation and maybe a business coach, maybe someone who is just out, maybe someone you don't have to hire, but maybe someone who is not a friend, but a friend in business, just to have a different perspective. That could be helpful sometimes. Sometimes there are peer groups that people get into, which could be helpful, or group thought could be bad sometimes if you're trying to think about fresh marketing. But there are some amazing resources online. So I think that, just sitting down and making it a priority is probably the biggest thing.
I would 100% agree with that. It's something that can easily just be pushed off, procrastinated on. Like, it's not necessarily fun. You probably have like writer's block or creative block about it, but like making it a priority, like you said, I think is number one.
Yeah, he's got to put this up, or maybe try to find someone who's just getting outside of school and they're motivated to help somebody like that, and maybe it would be more affordable because a lot of times, like I'm a creative director, but ask me to sit down and write a page worth of stuff, and I am handicapped. Like it takes me a long time to express myself in written word. If I can tell you the whole story in pictures and with my mouth in about 30 seconds. So I understand when people sit down to do these things that it's a little bit, but I think there's always, you have to do it. If you're going to be a business owner, eventually, if you want to get past a certain point, you're going to hit these walls, and some of these tools help them get past these walls.
Definitely. So, in your time as a branding expert and marketer, have you seen the definition of brand change with the introduction of like new digital media and tools? And if so, can you elaborate on that? Or maybe not. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, there's an argument, and I'm still taking inventory on. So there was some years ago when everything was online. You can purchase everything online. That brands won't matter anymore, and that really bothered me quite a bit. So
Yeah.
I didn't just shove it off. I started to like listen and pay attention, and I definitely disagree, and maybe more strongly than ever, because I think that user experience now is the brand for those online marketers, right? And if your shipment doesn't show up when it's said, your experience is going to be bad, and you will think about that brand in that way. So I disagree. And I think that more and more companies are trying to realize that they have to find a way to express themselves, because there's so much noise out there that if your brand does not stand out or mean something, then it will fall on deaf ears. So I think brand is now maybe perhaps more important. Where I feel like it's changed, where again, we talked about this a little bit. Now, some of these bigger companies have to have like social, I talked about the brand having a personality. And now I think the brands sometimes are being forced to think a certain way. And that could be really difficult to navigate as a company owner. And, I always felt like a brand should be still, it's not a person, it's a business. And I think that there's a distinction between there. So I don't like brands to go down that far personally. But some owners are very passionate about how they believe in things and who they want their customers to be. I think that you want, as many customers as you want. And I'd be careful on social things. I had that one client, not really a client, but somebody we helped do some brand development 4 years ago. And I watched during COVID that he posted something on Facebook, and I watched his business like collapse like in 48 hours because of
Wow.
how he handled particular negative feedback. And there was an opportunity to kind of back out, and he doubled down. And so messaging is powerful and important. And there's just some things I think businesses should sort of keep the brand away from, so that they can play in a space where people can just conduct commerce. It doesn't need to be taking sides on anything. I think that's a little dangerous for brands to take. So that's been a big change. Maybe that's been around forever, but I saw a big change over that in the last like 10 years.
I definitely have seen the same change. I thought it was interesting how you made the distinction that a brand is not a person. But I think because customers can more easily like reach brands and more immediately, like they can message them on Instagram or like, interact with brands in a way that wasn't possible a long time ago. Maybe people today think that brands are like people because of the ease of communication. I don't know if that has anything to do
Oh,
with this
that's
change.
okay. Now you got me thinking. That's
Oh,
that one's gonna sit in my head for a couple of weeks. Yeah, that's good.
we should do a whole other episode just on that topic.
Yeah, that's really good. And I, you know what? My gut would say you're partially right, that, unfortunately we're not as interacting with humans as much anymore. And so if you think about it, if some age or some people are just communicating through electronics, and they're doing the same thing with companies, is there a difference? So I think you're making a pretty good point there, that maybe in the electronic world, they almost are a person, or the equivalent of the relationships that you build. So
Yeah.
that's interesting.
And I'm not saying, what you said is right or wrong, but I just think that might be why that's happening.
No, I
Yeah.
think you're right. Nice insight.
Oh, thank you. Well, your insights made me think of that. So it's a
Yeah, that's good.
mutual thing. Well, this was so fun, Paul. Do you have, and thank you for all your amazing thought-provoking things. You had me thinking of all these like metaphors and images, and especially with the user and customer experience, a lot of really great thoughts. Do you have any other things that you'd like to share with the listeners before we wrap up today?
No, I think we covered a lot of good ground. I mean, I think, tying it back to jewelry, when I'm not doing marketing stuff, I'm an artist myself. And so I can I can, I think it's a great, it's a business that has a lot of rich creative in it. And I admire that. And I think that, a lot of times when there's a lot of creative, there's less of the business side, right? And so I think that, most people who are creative have to push themselves in that other area. So, I think the only thing I want to leave with is you got to make yourself uncomfortable a little bit. And I'm not assuming everybody in jewelry business is one way, but I would be willing to bet they're more on the creative side than they are maybe on the analytical side. And I think that, they have to push themselves to be a little bit in the uncomfortable zone before they, for part of their growth.
That's a great point. So our main takeaway from this is we want you to feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's good. I think
we
that's
want
part
you
of
to
being
squirm.
a business. Squirming is good. I see it all the time, especially in branding meetings. There's a lot of squirming going on sometimes. But that means you're getting into the real stuff.
I love
thank
that.
you for having me. Thanks for having me. I really, really enjoyed it. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks so much, Paul. I loved it. It was such a pleasure to be able to chat with Paul about marketing strategy and branding, and I hope our conversation slightly clarifies these topics for you if you did have any confusion about them before. To learn more about Paul's marketing agency, The Marketing Machine, visit www.themmachine.com. As a reminder, my book, Jewelry Marketing Joy, is published and available to purchase. If you'd like to learn more and get your own copy, visit joyjoya.com/book.